chapter 6 and verse 1 that the ark of the Lord was in the country of the Philistines 7 months. And what a 7 months it was, brothers and sisters. 7 is a number of completeness, and the destruction and devastation of the Philistines and their towns was nigh on complete. What I'd like us to do is, just before we go into this chapter 6, is just to get a bit of a refresh, a bit of a background of what actually happened in those 7 months. And it perhaps gives a bit more of an explanation, a bit more of an insight into the feelings that were going on, not just on the part of the Israelites, but on the part of the Philistines. For God was trying to prove a point, trying to give lessons, not just for the Israelites, but for the nations round about them, and particularly here, the Philistines. You may recall that, we won't turn at these quotations, but they're there for you. You may recall that the tabernacle and with the ark was at Shiloh, and the Israelites were camping at Ebenezer there, and the Philistines were at Aphek. And they came together in battle, and the battle was going against Israel in quite a serious way. So they got together and said, look, let's bring the ark of Yahweh from Shiloh to be with us, and he will save us. As though God could be a lucky charm. I think that was perhaps the thoughts of the people. So they brought the ark from Shiloh to Aphek, or between Aphek and Ebenezer. And at that point the Philistines were in great trepidation and great fear that the ark of the God of Israel had come before them. Yet they needn't have worried, because the battle was won for the Philistines, and the ark was taken from the Israelites, and it was taken to their capital Ashdod. And we know the story, how it was put in the temple of their god Dagon, and on 2 occasions Dagon was found prostrate before the God of Israel, in a clear lesson for the Philistines. But we read there, particularly about the people we want to consider this night, that the hand of the Lord was heavy upon them of Ashdod, and he destroyed them. It doesn't say how many he destroyed, but a great number, obviously, and smote them particularly with emerods, even Ashdod and the coasts thereof. So what were they to do? Well, let's get rid of the problem, and we'll send it to Gath. So no doubt their fellow citizens weren't too impressed that the fact that the ark was now coming to them, having heard of the destruction that was going on in Ashdod. So it came to Gath, and the result there was that in verse 9 there, that the hand of the Lord was against the city with a very great destruction, and he smote the men of the city, both small and great, and they had emerods again in their secret parts. So there's a bit of a pattern developing here. If you were destroyed, clearly you were dead and the city's with you, but those that were left with these emerods in their secret parts, very uncomfortable. So what were those of Gath going to do? Well, like their brethren before them, they said, let's get rid of the ark, and they sent it to Ekron. Now they've missed off here Ashkelon and Gaza, the other major cities, probably because of the fact it was a shorter distance to travel with the ark to go to Ekron rather than all the way down the coast to Ashkelon. Such was their need to get rid of the ark and get it out of their hands, that there would be no further destruction. So it came to Ekron, and we see there again in verse 11, there was a deadly destruction. Throughout all the city, the hand of God again was very heavy there, and the men that died not were smitten with emerods, and the cry of the city went up to heaven. So wherever the ark went, there was destruction and a terrible plague amongst the people. So let's go back to our chapter then, verse 2 then. The Philistines called for the priests and the diviners. Other translations have soothsayers or fortune tellers. But what struck me in this chapter is actually these priests and diviners, they were more attuned to the God of Israel than the Israelites were, and we'll work through that as we go through. But we won't turn to these quotations, but in Samuel 5 and verse 8 and 11, we find that the people in these cities, they didn't call for the priests and the diviners, they gathered together all the lords of the Philistines unto them, the 5 lords. And again in verse 11, after the ark had moved on, they called together all the lords and the Philistines. So why did they now call upon the priests and the diviners? Well, clearly the record of the lords wasn't very good, because as they'd gone through the cities, they'd met with utter destruction. So the counsel of the lords was not a wise counsel. And I think what's happened now is they've decided, well, from a military point of view, the lords, their strategy, it didn't work, moving the ark from town to town. Wherever it went, it destroyed the people. Perhaps we should look for a religious solution to this. So they call upon them, their priests and their diviners. And this was their counsel. We see there in verse 2, the people of the Philistine said to their priests, what shall we do to the ark of Yahweh? tell us wherewith we shall send it to his place. And a better translation would be, make known unto us what we should do with the ark. And the tense of the verb, it's an imperative. Please, quickly, make known to us what we should do, because wherever it's gone, we've been in utter destruction, and all our families have seen that, and we're in a great distress with these boils, with these emerods upon us. So it wasn't a casual, look, what is your counsel? It was a very great need and a very great urgency. And the counsel was, well, yes, send the ark away, but don't send it away empty. And they said, particularly there, a trespass offering. When we look at Leviticus, which we won't look there, it's the same Hebrew word. It does mean a trespass offering, as under the offer of under the Aaronic priesthood. So they clearly recognised, where others didn't, that they'd obviously offended the God of Israel. And if you're going to send the ark back, don't just send it back, but send it back with an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. And that was wise counsel, isn't it, brothers and sisters? If we have a problem, we ought not to be like the lords of the Philistines. If we've got a problem, let's push it away onto somebody else and hopefully they'll sort it out. No, we need to take control of what we've done, if something's gone wrong, and come before God and offer a prayer to God, be it a prayer of trespass or a sin offering. And so it was that I think it was wise counsel here from the Philistines. We see there's acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Something which Israel failed to do, didn't they? All this period, up until the taking of the ark, Hophni and Phinehas were the sons of the high priest, and Eli. They were wicked. They were going against the commandments of God. They never acknowledged their wrongdoing. But yet he's a Gentile nation that's looking upon that, and the Israelites could learn from the Philistines. But they made the point, if you get rid of the ark and offer a trespass offering, then you should be healed. So they've acknowledged that this trouble and tribulation that had come upon them was come from the God of Israel. And later on, I think the lords of the Philistines didn't believe that, and we had the test with the milk kind, which we'll discuss in a little while. But the Philistines, the diviners there and the priests, were quite sure that it had come from the God of Israel. And if you do as they ask and offer a sacrifice to God in the form of an offering of these emerods and the mice, then the plague will be stopped and you'll be healed. But how would you be healed? Well, clearly it's not going to be death. You're not going to be healed from death. It can only be the emerods upon them. And so it was that they did as the priests give them wise counsel to do. And clearly you would, because it's a very severe condition. It can be very painful. And the Hebrew word means, there you can see there, to burn. And we read that it was in the secret part, so it was in a very awkward position, which hemorrhoids are, if you've ever had them. And it's very painful. And such was the plague that was brought upon the Philistines. And they acknowledge there in verse 4 that it was a plague from God. But not just upon you, the great and the small, but the lords also. Nobody was excluded. So God left them in no doubt that the plague was upon everybody throughout that land, that he was displeased that they'd taken his ark. And there's a link here, I think, between the plagues, the emerods, and Egypt, as I want to develop. Because I think God's using this particular affliction. He could have chosen anything. He could have destroyed them with fire. He could have just destroyed them with a flood, hailstones. But he chose particularly the emerods and this particular form of affliction. We saw on that previous slide that the word emerald is used 8 times in the King James Version. The last 7 there are all found in Samuel, from 5 through to 6. But the other reference there, Deuteronomy 28, would you turn there please? We'll just have a look at this reference in relation to the emerods. It's part of the section on the blessings and the cursings to Israel. Blessings for faithful obedience and cursings for the contrary. So we see here in verse 27. He said, "The Lord will smite thee with the botch of Egypt, and with the emerods, and with the scab, and with the itch, whereof thou canst not be healed." So clearly whatever it was, that amongst that class of affliction was the emerods, as we see there, the scab and the itch. And they all have a similar symptoms and condition. Very painful, very sore, open wounds, and basically you're pretty much disabled in body and certainly in distress of mind. So it was a particularly nasty affliction to have. And we see the word there that the botch, it's a similar idea to the hemorrhoids, to burn, to be inflamed, like an ulcer. Exodus chapter 9, if you turn there, just for another reference, back to the plagues of Egypt. And we see it was the 9th plague that Moses is referring to here, as he's given the people the words of God. We know the account well, but verse 9 there, and it shall become dust in the land of Egypt, and shall be a boil breaking forth with blains upon man and upon beast throughout all the land of Egypt. So we see there verse 10, and they took the ashes of the furnace and stood before Pharaoh and sprinkled it upward toward heaven, and it became a boil breaking forth with blains upon man and upon beast. And so it goes on, but the point there in verse 14, the last verse there, he says, for I will at this time send all my plagues upon thine heart, and upon thy servants, and upon thy people. And the point he's doing that is, that thou mayest know that there is none like me in all the earth. And I think that's the principle that he was trying to show to the Philistines. You think you've got the ark of God, and therefore you've got the rule over him. But as he did with Pharaoh, when Pharaoh wouldn't let the people go, so was him with the Philistines, when they wouldn't let the ark go. He was going to make known to them there is none like him in all the earth. And we see there the reference there that we looked at earlier. Just as a matter of passing, it's the same boils that Job suffered, and Hezekiah also suffered as well. But clearly these weren't just a passing phase, this was life-threatening afflictions brought upon the people. And again, Exodus 15:26, if you just turn up there as well, if you would. We've got it on the screen, it is good to read these verses as well. Because at the end of this section, God has been proving the people, and he says in verse 26 there, and said, if thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and will do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee, which I have brought upon the Egyptians. For I am Yahweh that healeth thee. And I think the Philistines, they obviously knew their local history. The land of Philistine, the Philistines, is not far from Egypt. Everybody knew the fame that had gone abroad of the God of Israel, how he brought his people out of Egypt and destroyed Egypt with these plagues. And God is saying that no matter what you do, the Lord to the Philistines, whatever you do, it's only God that's going to take these things from you. And these priests understood that if you offer a trespass offering to God, acknowledge what he's done, because he's brought it upon you, then he is the great healer. He will heal you. Now, whether they knew these verses, whether they knew these principles, well, certainly they knew the principles, whether they knew the exact account here in Exodus remains to be seen. But nonetheless, I think they understood the principles. So let's just go back to our reading. We can see there, verse 4, what shall the trespass offering be? What shall we give? And they counsel 5 golden emerods and 5 golden mice, according to the number of the lords of the Philistines. And we know that the number of the lords in verse 17 was the lord that belonged to Ashdod, to Gaza, to Ascalon, to Gath, and to Ekron. Now we only saw in the previous chapters that it was only the 3 towns that appeared to suffer the hand of God. Now whether the other 2 cities as well, Ashkelon and Gath, whether they suffered the same fate, it's unclear. But nonetheless, they were going to offer a sacrifice in the form of these emerods and the mice for each of the lords, that the ark might not come to them perhaps, and they would suffer the same things. Now, not much is mentioned of the mice. It's just mentioned here. Why would you offer an offering of a golden mouse? Well, the next chapter, when you read there, verse 5, it says, you shall make images of your emerods and image your mice that mar the land. So it would appear that at the same time there was a plague of mice that had gone through the land as well. So it wasn't enough to be burying your dead and trying to pick up your dead. It wasn't enough that you were walking about lame with all these emerods, these tumours upon you. Then there's a plague of mice running through everything that you had. If you've ever seen a plague of mice, it's a terrifying thing. We haven't seen it firsthand, but in Australia, there's many plagues there, and you look closely at the TV images, and you see, well, where are the mice? And you look closely, and the whole street is just a mass of mice running when you're close in. So it's a terrifying thing. So I think that's why we have the emeralds that were made as images of, and also the mice. While the account doesn't detail any reasons why the mice were there, I don't know. But clearly it happened. So why would the people offer these things? Why wouldn't they offer a sacrifice of an animal or anything like that the God of Israel required of the Jews? Well, this commentary gives us perhaps some insight to that. It says, votive or thank offerings were commonly made by the heathen in prayer for, or gratitude after, deliverance from lingering or dangerous disorders, in the form of metallic, generally silver, in this case it was gold, and these were models or images in the shape and the likeness of the diseased parts of the body. So that perhaps explains why it seems peculiar to us. Why would you offer that as an offering to God? Well, it's a recognition that God sent the mice and God sent the emeralds upon them. And there's a recognition of that in what they sent back to God as a trespass offering. And the comment goes on, it's common in other religions as well, in other parts of the world. So going back then to verse 6, this is where I think that the Philistines have tuned into the fact that these plagues are upon them, just like the plagues that were in Egypt. And they say that, don't they? Wherefore then do ye Philistines, ye lords, that's why I think there's a bit of opposition there, why do ye harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh did? And they make the comment, he wrought wonderfully among them, and they didn't let them go. And they suffered the consequence. So the priest and the diviners are saying here, don't be like them. Let the ark of God go back to where it belongs, and you'll be healed. And hadn't God wrought wonderfully amongst them? Not wonderfully in a good sense, but wonderfully in a bad sense. He brought upon this death and destruction, the plague of mice and of emeralds. And when the ark of Israel came to the battle at Aphek and at I forgot what the city was now, whatever it was, the Philistines said, look at the ark, it's coming. These are the gods that smote the Egyptians with all the plagues in the wilderness. So clearly they knew their history. And when the pattern is developed of destruction and plague, they really had said here in verse 6, why do you harden your hearts like the Egyptians did and Pharaoh? So how are they going to get these emeralds, the golden emeralds and the mice back to the God of Israel? Well, they said, New King James Version here, make a new cart, take 2 milk cows, which have never been yoked, and hitch the cows to the cart, and take their calves home away from them. Now, why couldn't they have used bulls or old cows? They used cows that were in milk, i.e. they had calves. So it was a particularly sensitive time for the cows. And to separate the young from the cows and then send them away from them, it would be miraculous, wouldn't it? Because if you set these cows off on a journey and they heard their calves, what would they do? They wouldn't go straight, they'd go back to where they came from, wouldn't they? So this was going to be a real test. And we know that they made a new cart. Presumably the ark was transported from town to town on an old cart or by hand. Clearly this wasn't a problem for the Philistines, as it would have been for the Israelites, who had specific ways they should carry the ark, and specific groups of people, either Levites, who should carry the ark. But it would appear that this didn't apply here to the Philistines. They had different lessons to learn. And we note there that David did likewise when he brought the ark into Jerusalem. He made a new cart. It was sanctified, it was set apart to God, particularly for this purpose. But again, I think that's some care that the Philistines are taking. They realise now, if we're going to send it back to God of Israel, it's not going to be a big old cart that's perhaps seen better days. It's going to be a new cart with the ark on and the coffer or the box with the offerings next to it and sent off to the God of Israel. So they're very careful in their preparation. So we see there in verse 8, the New King James Version gives perhaps a bit of a clear translation of the word there. Then take the ark of the Lord, set it on the cart, put the articles of gold which you are returning to him as a trespass offering in a chest rather than a coffer by its side. Then send it away and let it go. So the test was then in verse 9, wasn't it? Let us watch. The ark's gone off with the cart. Will the cattle return, or will it go straight to God? And they said, if it comes back, well then it's been by chance. Now, I don't think they really believed that. I think they were trying to convince the Lord to the Philistines that if you're not sure, well, let's do this. I think they were very sure what was going on, because there'd been 7 months of plagues. Each town had fallen in turn. The people were smitten by this plague. Dagon in his temple was in bits prostrate before God. So I don't think there's any doubt in the priests of the Philistines in their mind, but I think now they're trying to convince the lords of the Philistines, who no doubt would perhaps be getting ready to battle again and go out and destroy the people again. But I think there's a bit more wisdom here from these diviners. So what have we got here then? Well, we've got the calves, the young calves that were in milk from the milk cows in the top there. And we see the ark was situated at Ekron, and then we have the ark sitting. It's the best I could get for a cart. It probably look nothing like this, but nevertheless it'll do for the purpose. So they're all there watching and waiting now. No doubt there was a great gathering of those that were sick and diseased, and great anticipation. What's going to happen? Well, we obviously know the answer because we've got the record. But for anybody that believed in the God of Israel, then we know which way it was going to go. It wasn't going to return back, but it was going to go forward to Beth Shemesh. And so the people would have rejoiced, no doubt, that the ark now was being got rid of. But it's remarkable, isn't it, that these calves, these milk cows, they went straight. They didn't turn, it says, to the left or to the right. They went straight. And yet, they hadn't had a yoke upon them before, but now for the first time they were tied to the ark. So you can imagine they would have been, jostling, trying to get away, and here and there, their young ones going. But they didn't. They went straight on, clearly under the divine hand of God. They were obedient to what God had wanted. And clearly there's lessons for us, isn't that, brothers and sisters? That we shouldn't turn from the right hand to the left. Would you tell me there to Deuteronomy chapter 5? This was the lesson that God was trying to teach Israel. Keep the commandments. Do as I ask. Don't turn from them, and everything will be well with you. Deuteronomy 5, verse 32. Moses tells the people, "Ye shall observe to do, therefore, as Yahweh your Elohim hath commanded you. Ye shall not turn aside to the right hand or to the left hand." Exactly what the calves did. Sorry, they keep on the calves, don't they? The cows did. But verse 33, just like the cow, you shall walk in all the ways which the Lord your God hath commanded you. It was a lesson for the Israelites in those days. And it's a lesson in these days too. And for ourselves, brothers and sisters, isn't it? We've got the commandments. We know what we should do. Let us in these last days not turn to the left or to the right. There's many distractions in this life. But let's keep that straight course and turning not to the right or to the left. Such was the importance that Joshua, when they went into the land, said exactly the same thing, trying to emphasise the point. If there's any exhortation, I think Joshua was telling them, then think upon these things. Joshua chapter 1. God is telling Joshua, be strong and of a good courage in verse 6. And then in verse 7, only be thou strong and very courageous, that thou mayest observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded thee. Turn not from it to the right hand or to the left, that thou mayest prosper whithersoever thou goest. And again, it's the same lesson, isn't it, brothers and sisters? Turn not to the right hand and to the left hand. And Joshua likewise would impart that to the people. Whatever we do, let's observe to keep the commandments and it'll be well with us in the land. It's the same for us. Going back into Samuel. So we see that the car took the straight way to Beth Shemesh. And Beth Shemesh is a city in Judah, as we see there. From Joshua 15, we see that in verse 10 there, all these borders, Mount Seir, Mount Jearim, of which Kirjath Jearim is part of the same area, they're all part of Beth Shemesh. and they're all part of Judah. So the kine went there. But we see in verse 12 there that the kine were lowing as they went. It's almost like for emphasis to the people that they didn't really want to go that way. They were calling for their young ones. But nevertheless, despite what they wanted to do, they did what God wanted them to do, again, under the divine hand. And the lesson for us, again, is obviously is similar, brothers and sisters. So just to make sure that the ark did get out of the land, we find the 5 lords of the Philistines were carefully walking behind it every step of the way to make sure that it went out of their land and did not come back. But in that we can see a cameo, can't we? We've got the ark, which is the presence of God. Obviously when the Lord Jesus comes back, the Son of God, when he comes back into Judah, towards Jerusalem, that likewise all those nations round about that he subdued and brought under his rule will likewise follow behind. Israel will no longer be the tail of all the nations, but the head of all the nations. And we see a glimpse, if you like, of the kingdom here, as this ark is going forth into Judah. And we find when they get there that it was the time of wheat harvest, which would explain why there would be a plague of mice at that time. There was plenty of grain, plenty of food for the mice to support such a plague. So again, natural events occurring, but brought together miraculously by God. So the scripture, wherever we look, we can just see little things. It gives us confidence and hope that what God has said, we can see that there's truth within the scriptures. And likewise, we can see here that it wouldn't be hard for a plague of mice to occur. But again, another picture of the kingdom, isn't it? The ark's returning. We can picture the Lord Jesus Christ, his entourage, returning to Judah and Jerusalem. And everybody's rejoicing. It's the time of wheat harvest, which is the first fruits, the Feast of Weeks. And so we have the Lord Jesus Christ, wouldn't he, coming to his kingdom, him being the first fruits of them that slept, returning to great rejoicing. Such was seen in Beth Shemesh, which means the house of the Son. Not the Son as in the Son of the God, but the Son, who will rise with healing in his beams. So it's a wonderful picture. A time of rejoicing. What the scriptures don't tell us is whether in that 7 months the Israelites sent out any search parties to try to find the ark. Whether they were so dismayed and downtrodden by the destruction by the Philistines that perhaps they didn't send anybody out to look for the ark. And so perhaps it would have been quite a surprise when all of a sudden there's this driverless carriage with 2 milk cows and the ark upon it just coming back to them. They'd been in battle, many had died, but now without a shot being fired, a slingshot, a bow, a spear, nothing. Just coming back, and all here was the sound of the hooves clicking and the wheels going round. And there it was, the ark coming back to them. No wonder there was great rejoicing. It's interesting again in verse 14 there, we see that the ark stopped and the cart right by this great stone. It could have gone anywhere. It could have gone anywhere in Beth Shemesh, but there was a great stone there, just the right size and shape to offer a sacrifice unto the Lord. So again, the divine hand, you can almost see the angels working there, invisible, but guiding the cattle to there to say, right, stop now, this is where you need to be. So just the little things here is quite miraculous, really, again, under the divine hand of God. And such was this event in verse 18 there, it was revered. It's known, it says in verse 18 there, as the great stone. It says, which stone remaineth unto this day in the field of Joshua, the Beth Shemite. So even to this day, as the writer saying in his time, this stone was revered because the ark had returned, and as we see in the scriptures there, they offered sacrifices to God. Just before we pass on from that, there's been some, amongst the commentators, some debate upon the actual meaning of the word stone. The Strong's number there, as you can see, number 59, if you look at that, it means a meadow. But the Hebrew is pretty similar. And so some think that, well, actually, if it was the Hebrew word 60, it would mean lamentation and mourning. And clearly the people were mourning, because when we look in verse 19, which we'll look at in a short while, the people were destroyed and there was a great mourning then. And the lamentation there is that the root of that word there, to wail and to moan. So that's just, there's a passing interest. So verse 19 there, as we said, the people lamented because the Lord had smitten them with great slaughter. We see in verse 15 that the Levites, we read there, took down the ark of Yahweh. Now if we look at Joshua 21, if you turn there please. We won't read all these verses, but we'll just see there verse 13. It says, thus they give to the children of Aaron, the priest. So the land that Aaron the priest and his family had and passed on throughout the generation to the Levites was, in verse 16, Ain with her suburbs, Juttah with her suburbs, and Beth Shemesh with her suburbs. 9 cities out of those 2 tribes. So we can see why there would be Levites there, and it was the Levites first that brought the ark down. So far so good, wasn't it? And while this is going on, the 5 lords of the Philistines, no doubt in hiding, just looking what was going on, seeing the sacrifices offered to God, the great rejoicing, and they returned and went away. Which I think is quite sad actually, because they'd witnessed the great power of God. They'd seen all these things. They'd seen the miracle of the ark going forward with these cows. Under natural circumstances, they wouldn't have done that, the cows, but they went straight in, straight to the stone. And perhaps at that time, the people were healed from the hemorrhoids, perhaps the lords themselves. And yet they decided they were going to return back to their old ways. And again, perhaps it's typical of the kingdom. Many are called, few are chosen. That they'll go to the judgment seat and will return into the world. And we know the end will be destruction. So let us be amongst those brothers and sisters that are rejoicing and we're not returning back into the world if we've come from there, in our minds or physically. Now there's been some debate amongst some different translations. It said when God destroyed the people that there was 50,000 and 310 men. But other translations read this. The English Standard Version says he struck 70 men of them. And again, the New Revised Standard Version, 70 men of them. And the Revised Standard Version, 70 men of them. Some commentators said, how could a small town like Beth Shemesh have such a great number? 50,070. Well, it was the time of the gathering of the first fruits, so there were a lot of people around there. Perhaps word had got around that the ark was being returning. But whatever the case, it doesn't really matter whether there was a few or a great many, because the principle is still the same. God destroyed the people for looking into the ark. Now, it didn't say that the Levites looked into the ark, but it said that the men of Israel looked into the ark. Read in verse 19. He smote the men of Beth Shemesh. It was the common Israelite, if you like, not the Levites, that had looked into the ark. And God smote them. So from one minute to rejoicing, to the next again, destruction again by the ark. No doubt there was many people thinking, well, we got rid of the ark, and now it's come back, and now we're being destroyed again. What on earth is going on? So they cry out, who is able to stand before this holy Lord God? And to whom shall it go up from us? Well, would you look at a couple of references here, Numbers? Because there's important lessons that they had to learn. Their response was, oh no, we're being destroyed again, let's get rid of the ark again. Who's going to take it from us? Yet, there's lessons to be learnt there, brothers and sisters, for them and for us, isn't it? That we can't just take God lightly, that we are to abide by his principles. And if the people would have listened, they would have should have stopped and said, why are we now being destroyed? What is going on? The result was, their thoughts were, let's get rid of the ark again. And again, it's easy for us to do that, brothers and sisters, isn't it? Easy for us to do that. We've got a problem, let's brush it away. Let's not face our God, let's just put it to one side. But the principles here are clear. Numbers 4 rather, verse 17. They shall put in it all the vessels thereof, this is the priests, wherewith they minister about it, even the censers, the flesh hooks, and the shovels, and the basins, etc., and so on and so forth. And verse 15, and when Aaron and his sons have made an end of the covering of the sanctuary, and all the vessels in the sanctuary, as the camp is set forward, what shall they do? They should not come to look at these things. They were to bear it, but not to look upon these things. And what did the children of Beth Shemesh do? What did the men do there? They looked upon these things, and they were smitten. And it's exactly what God had told the Levites to do. And this was the city of the Levites. So whether the Levites didn't explain to the people, whether the Levites were slack in explaining these principles, but nonetheless a precedent had gone before. And it was great that in Leviticus chapter 10, the account of Nadab and Abihu decided to take upon themselves they were going to offer a sacrifice to God by fire, not as God had commanded. And what happened, verse 2 there, the Lord devoured them and they died before the Lord. And again, this is the principle that needs to be borne out. Verse 3, and said unto Aaron, this is it that the Lord spake, saying, I will be sanctified in them that come nigh me, and before all the people I will be glorified. And that principle wasn't worked out here in Beth Shemesh, was it, brothers and sisters? And it's the same for us, isn't it, brothers and sisters? We worship a God that is a wonderful God, a loving God, but nonetheless, he's also a consuming fire if we take him for granted. So going back then to Samuel, rather than face the issue, as we said, their response was, well, how are we going to get rid of this ark? Who's going to take it from us now? So from rejoicing that the ark had returned, they wanted to get rid of it. But that's exactly what the Philistines did. So now they were no different. Because in 1 Samuel 5 verse 7 there, they say exactly the same thing. The ark of the God of Israel shall not abide with us, for his hand is sore upon us. Let's get rid of it. And alas, the Israelites that should have known better were exactly the same as the nations round about them. I've just brought up a few references. We don't need to turn these up. I'll bring them up for you. Isaiah 1 verse 19, God says to the people, if ye be willing, and the important point is, and obedient, ye shall eat of the good of the land. The people were willing when the ark came back, they rejoiced, but they were disobedient in the way they handled the ark. And it's a principle that's got to go hand in hand. It's not enough to believe in God, it's not enough to spread the gospel message, we have to abide by his commandments and his principles as well. And when we're speaking to anybody in the world about the God of Israel, it's not enough to say, I believe in God. We need to show it by the way we act, to show that we are obedient to what God wants, and we're giving a good example. Romans 16. Now to him that is of power to establish you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery which was kept secret since the world began, but now is made manifest, and by the scriptures of the prophets, according to the commandment of the everlasting God, made known to all nations, Philistines included, for the obedience of faith. Again, it's not just about faith, it's being obedient to the faith, isn't it, brothers and sisters? Worship God, but on his terms and not our own. Because like those of Beth Shemesh, the end result, if we don't do that, we'll be like them. It'll be death, eventually. So Timothy there gives us the encouragement, or Paul to Timothy. These people had a form of godliness, but they denied the power thereof, didn't they? And that was the point. They were willing, they had a form of godliness, which was basically the category of Israel at the time, but they denied the power of God. They didn't give God the glory. So we see then, the men of Kirjath-jearim came and fetched up the ark of Yahweh. No doubt there was great trepidation amongst them as well. They'd heard what got in the land of the Philistines, they'd heard what their neighbours had suffered, and now the ark was coming to them, so I can only imagine they would feel a bit uneasy. This city of Kirjath-jearim was not a city of the Levites, we see there. It's in the borders of Mount Ephron, and I just want to bring your attention the Baalah, which is with Kirjath-jearim. When we look at other parts of Scripture, particularly when David's bringing the ark up, he refers to Baalah. It's just another name for the word for the town of Kirjath-jearim. So we see then that the ark was in Ekron. It had gone to Beth Shemesh, where the ark was kept with rejoicing and sacrifice made to God. But then they took it away, and they took it then to Kirjath-jearim of Baalah, which is not that far away there. You see again, it's not too far from Jerusalem. Why the people didn't take it back up to the tabernacle that was in Shiloh at this time remains to be seen. But clearly it was going to be there for a reason. It's interesting that a lot of the commentators say that Eleazar was a priest, was a Levite. Yet I can find no evidence for that really. We look at all the, through the Chronicles, and we look at the family trees, and this Abinadab was not a Levite as far as I can see, and neither was Eleazar his son. Nonetheless, the word sanctified is used of the priesthood, but I think he was taken aside as a man worthy to look after the ark, because it says in verse 2 there, sorry, end of verse 1, sanctified Eleazar his son to keep the ark. It's not just keep it as in keep it in the cupboard under the stairs. It was to guard the ark, to hedge it back, to protect it. Well, from who? Well, from those of Israel that might decide to have another look in the ark and be destroyed. So it was keeping them out of the way, protecting it. But also from the Philistines, that the Philistines might decide, like Pharaoh, when they've recovered from their ailments, that they're going to come back and take the ark again. And their heart will be hardened again. So Eleazar was there, he kept as a guard. It wasn't just for a few months, it was for 20 years, we see in verse 2 there. It was a long time. And in fact, the ark remained there until David came. We see there, 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 2. David arose and went with all the people that were with him from Baal of Judah, which we saw was Kirjath-jearim, to bring up from thence the ark of God. So the ark remained there all that time until it was ready for David to come and bring it to Jerusalem, as God had planned. All the way through the scriptures we read, don't we, that when you go into the land, I'll take you to the place, I'll put my name there. It was never revealed, but the Psalms tell us, and obviously David understood, it was going to be Jerusalem now, and that's why the ark, I think, didn't go back to Shiloh. That part of the worship of God was going to be history, and now there's going to be a new beginning in Jerusalem. So reading 1 Chronicles a similar time. And David went up and all Israel to Baal, that is to Kirjath-jearim, which belonged to Judah, to bring up thence the ark of God, the Lord. And we see then that was its eventual stopping point in Jerusalem. So we've seen a lot of things in there, haven't we, brothers and sisters? I'd just like to summarise a couple of the lessons that we've seen, just very quickly. We see there that God can work in many ways. He doesn't need to be in great armies to do his will. We see that the people were destroyed without a shot being fired, without a sword being drawn. The Israelites were ignorant of the whereabouts of the ark, and yet, if they had the care for their God, they would have sent out search parties looking for it, to find out, where is it, we want it back. It appears that didn't happen. The shining lights of the animals, again, Job says, look at the animals and learn lessons from them. They did the will of God, didn't they? They're the only ones, perhaps next to the diviners and the soothsayers of the Philistines, that did what God wanted. They went about their business, not turning to the left or to the right, but doing the will of God. And the Israelites, again, they had to relearn the lesson that it's faith and obedience. We must approach God on his terms or suffer the consequences. But if we do what God wants, there's blessings galore. And again, I think the Philistines, they'd acknowledged the supremacy of the God of Israel. They'd sent the ark back. They didn't send it back empty. They'd give an offering to God. They'd realised that they'd done wrong. They'd offered a trespass offering, and they'd return it to its rightful place. And again, in the kingdom to come, all the people likewise, Philistines, everybody else, will recognise that the Lord, the God, he is one Lord, and is ruler of heaven and earth. So I hope you found that interesting, brothers and sisters, and hand it back to Anne. Thank you.